but then you have to put R30 in your walls in climate zone 6. But if you use the U factor alternative, for example, and you start to use advanced framing and eliminate studs and top plates and things, all of a sudden you get to bring that into your calculations, and you don't necessarily have to have R30 in your walls anymore.
Welcome to the Fine Homebuilding Podcast, our weekly discussion of building, remodeling, and design topics aimed at anybody who cares deeply about the craft and science of working on houses. I'm Senior Editor Patrick McComb. Today I'm joined by Fine Homebuilding Senior Editor Brian Pontalillo.
Hey, Patrick.
Fine Homebuilding Editorial Advisor Mike Gerton.
Hello.
And producer Andres Samaniego. Please email our questions to fhbpodcast@taunton.com. You can find previous podcasts and check out the show notes at finehomebuilding.com/podcast. It's great to have you guys here this afternoon. Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
It's good to see you. It's interesting to be doing the show in the afternoon.
What do you think? It's kind of a nice way to wind down the work week, is what I've observed. I think it's going to be great.
Well, I do every time we start the show, and I often say good morning, and I realize that to listeners of a podcast, it doesn't really matter what time
it doesn't mean anything to them.
So wherever you are, whatever time you're listening, hope everything's great.
Mike, I want to get right to the photo you sent me yesterday that showed your better half sticking out of a swamp cooler ductwork, it looked like. Can you explain what you were doing to your house in Arizona?
Well, just so that listeners who are not looking at the photograph know, the better half doesn't mean my wife. It means my backside. The last time or a couple times ago I was on the podcast, I was talking about the ductwork in my house, which is encapsulated inside of a chase which runs down the middle of the house, and I got a flat roof, so it's really contained where I can't access it. And one end that I was putting a bathroom fan in, I discovered that the ductwork was all crushed. Well, since then, I went to the other end and I was reversing a washer dryer arrangement, which was in the garage, and I spun it around to be in a hallway. And when I opened that wall up, it gave me access to the opposite end of the ductwork chase. And I discovered unconnected ductwork over there. And then I wanted to remove a swamp cooler, which was the original cooling system for the house. And somebody had maybe 15 years ago, put in a conventional refrigerant-based cooling system. So they had both the swamp cooler and the refrigerant-based air conditioning connected to the same duct. But when the regular air conditioning system worked, it would blow air into and out of the swamp cooler. So I wanted to disassemble that. I thought it was going to be a 45-minute job, just taking the ductwork apart. And when I took the ductwork apart and I looked down into the main duct, which ran vertically into the horizontal ducts, which ran left and right through the house, you could see the telltale signs of what occurs when you run a swamp cooler for a long period of time, which is swamp coolers work by basically dribbling water over a mat, and that water, as air blows over it, chills the air, because in the desert Southwest it's so dry you get rapid evaporation, so it's evaporative cooling. But if you oversaturate those mats, the water dribbles down inside the duct and rusts the ductwork out. So I had to actually dive into the ductwork where I only had my thighs out of the duct. The rest of it, my body had to go down into it first to assess the problem, and then to work for 2 solid days in anticipation of a bad rainstorm we were going to get, to refit steel inside, reline steel inside of the old ductwork, which is nearly impossible when you're working
from the inside.
From the inside, I was in the duct. The main duct shaft going down was a 24 by 24 or 24 by 22, and then that dropped about 24 inches. And then when it went horizontal, which I had to do the repairs on, that was only a 10 inch by 24-inch wide. So it was the worst. I of all the jobs I've ever done working on houses, that was the worst, most awkward, most painful job I've ever done in my life.
How did you not get cut to ribbons? Because my experience, even looking at sheet metal and ductwork, leaves me bleeding.
Gloves. I had an insulated winter gloves, even though it was warm out, knowing that I would be, slicing and dicing the gloves up. But yep, made it through it. So now, what's amazing is, whereas before the heating would be running all the time when it would get cold out, because probably 50 or more percent of the air was being blown out through all sorts of holes. Now it's like warms up the house by 15 degrees or 10 degrees in maybe an hour and a half. So makes a big difference.
Can you guess how the ductwork that you discovered came to be disconnected? I mean, you mentioned the rusting, that's one problem, but you mentioned other disconnects. How did that happen, you figure?
Well, the first one that I described a few episodes ago was where somebody put a bathroom fan in, and
Yeah.
they just smashed out the duct board, because it was just fiberglass duct board, and they just crushed it and broke it apart to get their fan in. They had, I'm guessing, one thing in mind, which was to put in a bath fan. At the other end, it was flex duct. Somebody had modified the heating system, cooling system, and had run a couple of additional registers into a far flung bedroom, and they used flex duct, and the flex duct had disconnected on two of the registers. So the flex duct was basically blowing the air into a small cavity, and some of it would just leak into the house. Otherwise, it was just blowing out of the bird block vents in the through the rafter bays.
Those kind of disconnects are surprisingly common and are a huge hit on efficiency. Yeah.
Precisely.
Wow.
It's one thing if you can get
Have
into
you?
an attic to assess the condition of ductwork, though we don't recommend people put new ductwork in attics anymore just for efficiency. But when we do that, we're putting the ductwork inside of the living space, in the sense that it's contained in horizontal chases through either trusses or eye joists, or just through a drop down soffit. And if it's not done well when it's initially installed, you don't have access to any of that to make repairs in the future. So you're really counting on the initial work that was done to last generations of a house's life.
When you were doing your diehard routine, climbing around inside the ductwork, were you tempted to just rip the walls down to get access to it? From the house side of the
It,
ductwork.
so yeah, yes, and I may still do that in the future. It would be this built-in chase that runs down the center of the house. It's about they've modified it because it's in hallways and things, so I could cut out the ceiling drywall and then work on it. But with guests here and my wife, and coming in the future, my wife doesn't want to have the living space um, in shambles for that period of time. So I had to suffer the work on the exterior and doing it from the inside out instead of the outside in.
Well, I applaud your efforts. I'm sure that's going to make a huge difference in comfort and efficiency of your house. I can't imagine. That's,
I'm
yeah,
looking
huge.
forward to seeing the lower energy bills.
Yeah. Andres, have you had anything similarly exciting with your ductwork to work
No, I
on?
don't have any ductwork in my house, but I have had in apartments. However, most of the ductwork was, a straight line. Only a few. It's a small living area, and there were apartments, so everything was inside the walls.
I've never heard of anyone being able to get inside of trunk lines before. I think that's pretty incredible and a testimony to your fitness level.
Yeah, I think you and
How
I
about you,
have.
Brian? Have you been work?
No, I was just saying, you got to be skinny to do that kind of stuff.
Yes, indeed. How about you, Brian? You done anything as exciting as Mike's been doing?
If you depends, I guess, on your proclivities. I've been up to my eyeballs in the energy codes the last couple of days, editing the next Know the Code. department for Fine Homebuilding with which as people probably know if they read Fine Homebuilding, is always written by Glenn Mathewson. And I just started working on this department. I've always loved this department, but I just started working on it as an editor, a couple issues ago, and I really am surprisingly enjoying working on it. For one thing, Glenn's like a national treasure when it comes to the building codes. He's just wonderful. If you don't know Glenn and you work with the building codes at all, I would look him up. I think it's Building Code College, right? Is his business?
Yep.
Building Code College, and Glenn. I remember one of the first times I ever interacted with Glenn, he told me or explained to me how the building codes are meant to be a service for the builders, and how that if you really understood how the building codes work, they give builders lots of opportunities and lots of options, and that was just speaking with builders. About building codes, you often get grumpy replies, as if the building codes are just kind of restrictions and limitations and sort of doctrine. And I think the difference maybe that I'm starting to realize between the building codes and those builders' experiences, that's maybe building officials, not the building codes. And the way Glenn teaches us to understand the building codes is like, they really come to life and become this sort of wonderful tool. So we were working on the 4 paths that you can take to energy compliance through the current IRC, International Residential Code. And so there's a perfect example, right? I think many people know of the prescriptive chart that gives you the necessary U factors for doors and windows, and the necessary R values for the insulation in walls and ceilings and roofs and basements and slabs and such. But that's only one way to meet the energy code. And as you move to the UA alternative, which is calculating overall U factors for a building, or to using the performance model or a HERS rating, all of a sudden there's many different ways any project can meet the energy codes. So that's what I've been doing the last couple of days, and I think it's going to be another excellent department from Glenn when I cut 1,000 words out of it. And yeah, that's what I've been up to.
That's awesome. I learned something, and it's perhaps anecdotal, but that the 2024 code has lower R value requirements than the 21 version, and you guys are both nodding. Can you tell me what the difference is, Brian, if you know?
Well, I don't know Glenn could actually probably come on and explain this a little better. The reason for the codes reverting back to sort of the energy requirements of, I think, the last
2018,
version is,
I think it was.
is what
Yeah.
I've heard. I'm going to guess that it's pushback from building industry organizations who are concerned about costs, and that is I'm all for energy conservation, and costs are understandable, right? When you can't, when you can no longer meet the requirement for R value in a wall, in a 2x6 wall in the colder climate zones, most of the colder climate zones, I think 5 and up, or maybe it's 4 and up. But when you can no longer meet that in a 2x6 wall, unless you choose one particular insulation type, closed cell spray foam, then you are adding costs to a building by having the significant costs, actually, because you're changing assemblies. And so I think it's that kind of thing that the pushback is all about. I in this case, personal opinion, but I think it's unfortunate. I'd rather see builders learn to maybe either meet these prescriptive codes or use these other paths that I was just talking about, because you can, if you use, for example, if you use just the R value computation chart in the code, and it says you need R30 insulation in your walls in climate zone 6, then you have to put R30 in your walls in climate zone 6. But if you use the U factor alternative, for example, and you start to use advanced framing and eliminate studs and top plates and things, all of a sudden you get to bring that into your calculations, and you don't necessarily have to have R30 in your walls anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So this is actually a good example of how Glenn says that the codes can work in your favor. Maybe it takes a little bit more work than opening the book and looking at the chart, but it's not, to say that the building code requires R30 insulation in walls, in cavity insulation in walls in these climate zones is actually not true. It requires that if you follow that one path to energy compliance, if you use any of the other ones, it might not be R30 in those walls.
The complexity of codes, and especially once you get outside of prescriptive codes, is probably an amazing topic for a podcast after show. We should ask our listeners to weigh in with their questions about that subject, and maybe we can cover that in a future after show because it's so big, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I mean, maybe we could have Glenn on and help him, have him help us answer some of these questions. Yeah. Yeah, get some answers.
If you bring Glenn on, make sure the after show is at least 2 hours long.
It has an adult rating.
Well, I haven't found him to be foul-mouthed, but he explains things very deeply, and
Yes.
he goes on lots of tangents, which is great. I mean, I've learned so much from him over the years because we correspond off on personally, and great guy.
Well, and one of the things I'll stop singing Glenn's praises after this, but one of the things that I really appreciate about him and his knowledge about the codes is that he doesn't necessarily editorialize or add his opinions. He just wants people to understand how to work with the building codes. I mean, not that he never has an opinion, because Glenn definitely has some opinions, but he also just wants you to understand this is the building code. Especially in his writing, I think he wants that to be clear, because I've kind of complimented him on a few things that he's added that I thought were helpful that came from his experience as his experience building, and he just kind of said, I do try to stay away from that. I just want people to understand how the code works.
I want to get on the soapbox here very briefly about carbon monoxide and smoke detectors. So a carbon monoxide detector typically lasts about 10 years, and I don't know if they all do it, but mine started chirping, and helpfully on the back of the detector is a little chart that tells you how to interpret what the respective number of beeps means, and it was clear that the thing had come to the end of its life. And so to make installing a new one easier, I tried to order the exact same thing on Amazon. And the model's been replaced. And that's fine. Products get replaced all the time. But I was really hoping that the mounting ring would be the same. So the swap would be simply a matter of unplugging the old one and putting the new one back up there. But not only is the ring different, but the pigtail that connects it, and keep in mind this is the same brand of product with a newer version replacing the older one. They replaced the pigtail that connects to the AC wiring. So you have to swap that too, which means turning off the power. And, for me, doing one of these is no big deal. And it's probably a waste of everyone's time for me even to be bringing this up. But imagine if you had an apartment building with dozens or hundreds of units, and all of a sudden your 2-3 minute job suddenly is a 10 or 15 minute job, not done by a maintenance technician, but now you have to hire an electrician, and you have to turn off the power in the unit to swap out the connection. It just struck me as really annoying, and I had to ask, do designers and engineers think about any of this stuff? I was just kind of stunned. I was like, why did someone make this different and make it hard to replace? And, if it didn't have a designed lifespan, like a light fixture or, some other thing you'd install in your house, that's one thing. But they know this has to be replaced in 10 years because it doesn't work anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it seems like there's so many things that I wish were. I was trying to stick a wireless mouse into my MacBook the other day, and MacBooks no longer have USB ports, so you have to have an adapter for the USB-C to put the wireless mouse USB, transmitter into the Mac, and it was just one of many things that I wish were universal. And you're right. And then it would be good marketing for them too, Patrick, because then on new carbon monoxide and smoke detectors, they could write on the packaging like universal plate design and sell more of them for that reason. So they could make it work in their favor for sure. I got these ceiling fans for my house that operate on remote controls, overhead ceiling fans with lights in them, and that's the only way they operate, right? Because they have this brain in them, and you have to use the remote control. I had talked to our electrician about possibly like could we kind of
bypass that, yeah,
bypass that and just have switches for these. I didn't want to have remote controls, but he said no. He said you can't. They have this brain in it. It operates with the remote. So we installed them with the remotes, and one of them, which is the one that is unique, so it's the only remote that we have. The battery was dead in the remote the other day, and I open it up, and it's like a watch battery. And I don't have these laying around, so no ceiling fan or light until I could get to the store to get that watch battery. Not that I can't get to the store to get the watch battery, but it's just another thing that now, if I want to be able to operate that all the time, I have to have extra R30 or whatever the battery type is laying around the house.
There are so many design considerations that drive me crazy in consumer products. I'm just like, did anyone try this? Who made this thing? We had a best of show recently, and we got some feedback on some old subjects, but I thought it was good, so let's bring them up here. So this comes from John. Hey, Patrick and friends. It was interesting to hear y'all from years ago on this greatest hits episode of the podcast. I had a couple of reactions I wanted to share. It sounded like the work truck carbon footprint question must have been from around 2017. I think that was when the plug-in hybrid Chrysler Pacifica came out. You can fold the seats into the floor of that vehicle, so it's just like a Dodge Grand Caravan. You can haul 4x8 sheets of goods flat on the floor. I looked up what one of these things costs, and it's $51,000 to $55,000. You didn't touch on trailers. I'll share a picture of you with my dump run I did with my 4x8 utility trailer behind a Toyota Yaris. I put hitches on all my vehicles. It's easy to do, and they make them for every model. I tow huge saw logs frequently behind my Prius. You can probably move anything you would want to with in the back of a pickup and a trailer behind just about any car. I found that this is exactly what they do in Ireland when I visited there this fall. They just aren't afraid of what others might think of them when they move stuff. I think you were misinformed when you recorded that episode about EV range. The 2017 Chevy Bolt was out by then, which you can get a hitch on. It gets 230 plus miles per charge. You could get those for $26,000. New at the time, after the tax credit of $7,500. A used one was about $15,000 before the tax credit. There's now two really great options for real electric powered pickup trucks at two affordable levels. You can get a Ford Maverick pickup, which comes standard with a hybrid engine getting around 45 miles per gallon for around $20,000. The payload is the same as a half-ton truck. And we should mention Ian has one of these, and we can probably talk to him on a future podcast about what his experience has been like. But I know he's pretty psyched about the mileage he's getting on his pretty long commute. The second truck that's on another level is the electric F-150. You've probably seen these on the streets now. They have a ventless grill like all EVs, but otherwise look like an F-150. They perform like a half-ton truck too, so you can haul big trailers, which in my mind is the only reason why trucks are really ever needed. The F-150 Lightning gets a $7,500 tax credit, and the original price for the base model when it came out was around $40,000, but it's now about $50,000. The tax credit gets it down to $42,000, which is less than a Rivian EV, the nearest competitor. And we included Josh Salager's review of his F-150 Lightning in a past issue of Fine Homebuilding, and I'll put that on the podcast episode page for folks to look up if they're curious. Josh's observation was that he didn't need a generator hardly as much because he could charge his cordless tool batteries with a pickup truck, which I found to be very interesting. That was a use I couldn't even have imagined, that you could ditch a generator and use your truck to charge up all your tools.
Do you all know if there is yet a electric or hybrid cargo van? Any of these sort of tall roof cargo vans have that option yet?
The only thing I know of, Brian, are things that Amazon has had built for their purposes that are pure electric, and but
Yeah.
I don't know of a one you can buy, honestly.
I'm
Mike,
sure. I'm sure we'll.
Andres.
I'm sure we'll hear from listeners who are familiar with that. Yeah, I'm not familiar.
This comes from Bill. He says, I'm a huge fan and love the show. I noticed in episode 612 you mentioned it was okay to caulk or use foam around LED fixtures. I think you were probably correct here, but I wanted to share a cautionary note about off-gassing of VOCs and color shift and light degradation with LED lights. When the shift to LED lamps started to take off about a decade ago, there were reports of off-gassing induced color shifts from adhesives used within the lamps themselves. The industry, encouraged by the Department of Energy, was really careful about third-party testing for light output and lumen maintenance. In my area, some folks were able to private label lamps purchased offshore, get their third-party testing, and hawk them to commercial showrooms and business customers with utility incentives. Sadly, after about 18 months, the lamps began to unevenly shift to a dingy yellow color with dramatically less output. I guess the VOCs were eating up the phosphor coating over the LED chips. Luckily, I got tipped off to this phenomenon from an industry trade journal, and when I did a large project with a local museum, we were able to use some products that were from a well-known manufacturer with warranties that colored and prevented the covered color shift. Depending on how close caulk or spray foam is to the lamp, wafer light, or integrated lamp downlight, the same phenomena could occur, but hard to say. What do you guys think? Have any of you heard of this phenomenon? No.
Nope,
This
I
is
haven't heard
what's
of it.
so great about our
So
podcast is we get some input from people who are in very different parts of the building environment, right?
so the VOCs are creating the degradation of the LED diode. That's what is apparently happening here.
Specifically, it's the phosphor coating that makes it have the appealing color. And
Uh-huh.
when this is damaged, it makes it have a weird cast of tone, and its output is reduced.
Fascinating that it's fascinating that it's from that it's a result of off gassing.
Yeah, from another product
Yeah.
nearby. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's actually in the lamp itself, but it's not part of the LED
Right.
diode, the actual light producing thing.
Yeah,
It's
I've not
probably
heard of that.
something gluing the whole thing together, right? Or holding components inside the lamp, is my guess.
Yeah. There is I don't fault anyone for being nostalgic for good old incandescent lamps. I feel like LEDs have yet to really live up to their promise. But we'll get there, I think.
Now think.
They're better than the CFLs. Oh my gosh! Now that was a product that was just horribly oversold, and that was terrible.
I wonder what it'll be like looking back 50 or 80 years from now when people will pine about the old days when the good old LEDs were there, and now we've got these some newfangled uh, quantum
It's
leap
true.
lighting that has
Yeah.
color shift of all kinds of problems. You never know.
Well, those of you who write into the podcast, thanks so much for your knowledge and experience. It really makes this show more interesting and better. Thank you so much. Today's podcast after show I wanted to mention is about training carpenters and let's call them builders, folks who are the ones who are physically managing or putting the house together. We used to call them carpenters, but I think they do a lot more now, especially with the advent of lead carpenters and kind of team approaches to building. But Rob Watzak was asking me, based on a conversation he had with his wife Michelle, about how carpenters are trained, and he didn't really have a good answer, and I didn't really have a good answer. So I thought it would be a good thing to talk about in the after show, and it's different, I would say, than other trade work. Wouldn't you guys agree?
In many ways, yes.
Our first question comes from James in Ottawa. Hi, FHB crew. I'm just about to install painted trim around our new windows, but the jamb extensions do not align with the face of the drywall as planned. The jambs are short, anywhere from 1/8 to 3/8 inch. I think the window flanges were slightly curved, which shifted the window outwards when it was installed. Most of the offsets are consistent for a given jamb, but a couple have slope too. I can probably caulk the 1/8 inch gaps, but 3/8 is too much for that. Any suggestion on how to fill that space, especially when it varies from one end to the other? Um, so I asked James what kind of casing he was going to install because I think that matters in this discussion. But Mike, I'm sure you've run into this situation before. What did you do?
Oh, I run into it all the time, and it can occur for any number of reasons. Um, Sometimes when we put in sill pan flashing with flanged windows, we end up kind of kicking the bottom out a little bit because the flanges will sit on that sometimes thick pan flashing, and when they get built up at the bottom corner. But I'm more familiar with it in our area in Rhode Island, southern New England. Veneer plaster is a super common way to finish our walls rather than drywall with a just regular joint compound. So the veneer plaster can build out a thicker thickness than what your standard jam extension would account for. So about 30 years ago, we gave up on purchasing those standard jam extensions that the window manufacturers manufacture, and we just rip our own jams. So we taper rip all of our jams to account for, or rip custom, I should say, custom rip all of our jam stock for what the window needs, so that we don't end up with that gap that James is experiencing. It's unfortunate, and I don't know of any other way to manage shimming or filling a large gap with standard jams to bring it out to your drywall plane.
It might be, too illustrative of my skills as a carpenter, but I've had to deal with this and a rabbeted casing, right? If you can put a little rabbet that laps onto the extension jam, and creates relief for the back, the rest of the casing, you can sometimes fudge this. I would sure try giving a good shove on those windows that are not lined up on the inside, because sometimes you can get those flanges to flatten out to a more 90-degree angle.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they are slightly off that, and it makes the window stick out. So if you can really shove on that, sometimes they'll go back in. But if it's up on a second story without a deck or whatever to work on, that's pretty hard.
Now that I think of it, one of the things we used to do before we custom cut our jams, extension jams, we would fabricate our casing, miter it and spline it, glue them up, and then we would hold it in position on the window where the drywall was deeper, and you end up with that gap between the jam and the casing. We would then score the drywall, we'd smash it out with a hammer, and then we would basically inset the that trim, the casing, into the drywall just a little bit, and then we'd or the plaster, and then we would just touch up the drywall around the perimeter where we damaged it. That way we got a good tight fit wood to wood at the extension jam to casing, and we didn't have to trouble ourselves with the caulking there. Then we would leave it to the painter to deal with a small gap that might occur along the drywall to trim edge.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a time-tested way, is to smash the drywall, basically,
Yeah,
right? Yeah, just
you did
smash
that.
the raw edge closest to the extension jam so it's more tapered, not
Hmm.
sticking out beyond it. Yeah.
Right.
I think it's like there's a big difference between an 1/8 inch and 3/8 inch in this case.
Hmm.
You know what
Yeah.
I mean? Like You can definitely an eighth inch is number. First of all, I think an eighth inch is going to be hard. It's going to be challenged to do an extension, little little eighth inch extension jam. Because you have to cut a sliver, and if that needs a taper, you have to cut a tapered sliver. You have to not have it split when you try to install it. All that stuff. So I think I've smashed drywall too to make trim work, and for smaller gaps that works. But 3/8, I think I would use a track saw and
Tapered jams. Make a little
make
extension.
yeah,
Yeah.
make a little extension jam and just be really careful installing it.
I would try and rabbet the casing first, and if that doesn't work, and it depends on the thickness of the casing whether you can do that. You need to be able to take 3/8 of an inch out of it, right, in order to accommodate your biggest gaps.
And Patrick, what would you do can you do that if it's an inconsistent? I mentioned the track saw because you can just take a measurement at the top and the bottom and rip a straight line. But what would you do with your rabbited trim if it's inconsistent?
I would kind of fudge it to
Yeah,
have it away from the wall at its greatest
yeah,
thickness, and have it kind of pushed. You know what I'm saying? I would split
yeah.
it 50-50 so it was gappy and flattened, right?
And then caulk that gap between the outside edge of the trim and the drywall, which you're probably going to have a little bit of caulking to do there anyway. So
Yeah, and it seems less noticeable than if
yeah,
on the window, right?
Yep.
yeah. And the kind of trim fudging trim in tricky spots does have a lot to do with the type of trim, right? Like even like running baseboard, where the mud's built up at corners and it kicks the baseboard out from the wall a little bit. And if you have trim with a little bit of flex, you can just push it right into the wall. But if you're using like 3/4 inch flat stock and it's real stiff, you're not going to be able to do that. So your trim choice does have a lot to do with fudge factors in situations like this.
You can, Brian Campbell clued me into a technique he uses, and he kind of cuts the miter at a slight bevel, so it's actually tilting in somewhat toward the extension jam. It's it's tilted so the thicker edge, the away from the window edge, is slightly proud of the wall surface, but it'll tighten up gaps, and it'll also get the leading edge tighter to the extension jam if that's the issue. And I'll put a link to that article because there's some other good techniques for finished carpentry, and it's called Tighter Miters by Brian Campbell, and that was pretty recent, good stuff. This next question comes from Joe. Joe asks, "Hey, FHB podcast, I thoroughly enjoyed the recent episode with Bill Bellick and Shou Industry. I'd love to make a greenhouse in the next year or two, and I plan to use it as an opportunity to practice some basic timber framing. Based on Bill's comment about anticipating a 10% reduction in structural capacity, I have the relevant info to design a frame for the greenhouse I want. However, I have a process question. Should I erect the frame and then apply the Shou Bond treatment, or should I do the treatment in pieces to protect the joinery? Also, I think it would be fun to have Carol on a podcast. All the years Patrick has been on the show, I don't recall her ever being on. I'd like her thoughts on making raised beds with Shou Bond and whether the treatment would have effect on plants or the soil. Perhaps she would have insights about performing construction projects near gardens and landscaping. For example, I never knew chewing tobacco was bad for tomatoes till a coworker mentioned it to me years ago. I would say chewing tobacco is bad for most stuff. Anywho, I thought this would be a short question, but here I am rambling on again. Love the podcast. Happy New Year. Joe, thanks a million. And I mentioned to Carol about this, and she said she would be willing to do that. So now that I've said it in front of you all, I think she can't back out. So there you go. I'm going to say that. Go ahead, Mike, please.
I was, regarding Carol, I'm glad that Joe brought it up because it was a question I was going to ask you, and I've been meaning to for a couple of podcasts. Is like you've mentioned Carol a number of times, both with the work that you've done around the house and with her work on on your landscaping, and it was like she's probably a good resource and somebody to have on the
Yeah.
podcast. Yeah.
Yeah, and what a great question about this finishing technique for raised beds and other things like that. Where I think of raised beds that you might have. If you you could use pressure treated lumber for raised beds that you're going to grow flowers in, but you wouldn't want to use it for vegetables. So, so I'm always wondering, like, what are good, rot resistant options for raised beds? Or I'm going to be building a compost bin in the next, soon, I hope. And so I wonder if it is. We didn't ask about ground contact when we did that episode of the podcast, but I wonder if it is rot resistant enough to use for things like that.
Carol's first response is like, "Why would you waste it like that? Put it in the dirt." And part of me says the same thing. She said that the plants wouldn't care with the Shou bond. She's like, fires are a normal part of ecology until pretty recently, and like plants can deal with that.
Yeah.
As far as
So what
timber
about
framing, I don't
yeah?
know about this as a good idea, right? I mean, so the idea with Shou bond, as I understood it from Bill, was like this was a protection meant for claddings, for siding, that was meant to be affordable for working class folk to protect their houses with something you could do without a product or expensive stock. But like a timber frame should be protected from the weather. It's not meant to be exposed outside. Is my thinking wrong in this?
Well, I'm going to
Well,
guess. I'm going to guess that Joe's thinking of it for the aesthetic of it, and the frame would be exposed on the inside of the greenhouse, so he's not concerned about the weather resistance or the durability
mhm.
that he would get from the charring of the wood. It's more the look of it on the inside of the timber frame. So
Yeah. And then in terms of his question about when to do the treatment, I mean, I don't know because I've not done this before, but the two things that came to pop to my mind were like safety and control. And if you have this timber frame erected, you're going to be using a torch up on a ladder, and you might not have as much control if you have fire and you have things catching fire, and you might not be able to control it as well as having these parts of the timber frame set up close to the ground where you can be standing on the ground and have anything you need for safety nearby. That was like I said, I haven't done it before. That was the first thing that came to mind.
I don't know that like timber frame joinery is rated or designed or ever engineered to have had a degree of charring, right? Like I don't think that's I think that's risky, right? What if you burn a tenon too much, as an example?
see, I have the opposite feeling, or not. I don't not necessarily opposite, but I don't think it's going to be when you char it. Just from the experience with my little experiment, it's it's tiny. It's like a 16th of an inch that you're really, unless you want a really deep char. If you just want to cook the surface and either get it light brown or just a black rather than the deep alligator, then you're really not impacting, I think, the strength of the joints in timber frame joinery. So I wouldn't worry there. What I'd be more worried about is if you pre-cut it and you got all your tenon and all your joints, you're going to be rolling those flames over the joint where you would ordinarily want a nice tight fit. So you're going to end up sort of rounding corners with the charring. So they're not going to get that same look. Um, what I would do and recommend would be for Joe is to make up a timber frame joint, completely built, assembled, then char the wood. Then do another experiment, another joint where you char everything before you put it together and just see how it works and how it looks. That way you know what you're getting into, because if you do it before, excuse me, yeah, if you char the wood before you install it, you're going to be black all over. There's no way around that. Whereas if you assemble the whole thing and then you get up on a ladder carefully, which I think you can do, and quickly go over it, and maybe have a hose ready just in case something gets out of control. I don't think it will. And then you won't be getting your body all black working with the wood, because it would already, all your intricate timber framing would be done and all the pieces would be lifted in place. So, yeah. It's going to be a little experiment. We'll be interested to hear how it works out and what it looks like when it's all done.
Yeah.
Amen. This comes from Jonathan. Hey, podcast team. Thanks for your thorough discussion in episode 587 After Show on installing hardwood flooring on concrete floors in basements. I want to install hardwood flooring on a slab on grade concrete floor, and the hardwood needs to meet up with carpet. I'm afraid to install 3/4 inch subflooring underneath since the hardwood will be so much higher than the carpet and make for a trip hazard. It looks like there's a method described on GPA to install poly vapor barrier and float engineered hardwood on top to create a floor that should be in line with the height of the carpet. Would you recommend this? Why or why not? Thanks for your great advice, Jonathan. Okay, so I think we should start off this conversation by asking, is it okay to put hardwood flooring in a basement? What do we think about that for starters? Below grade, I guess, is the distinction.
Well, I'm not sure if that's the case. The way I read the question, he was asking. He mentions a discussion about basements, but then he says that he's asking about a slab on grade concrete floor.
It's a walkout. It's a walkout basement with
Oh, okay.
the one side to a patio door, I believe, and the other side
Okay.
is a few feet below grade.
Gotcha. Okay.
So, what do we think about putting hardwood flooring in a subgrade environment?
I think it's just as risky as putting carpet on a basement floor in that,
Yeah.
you got a moisture sensitive material. You could have condensation in different places. You could have all sorts of moisture. It's really going to depend on that basement and basement slab. Now, if it was on a brand new house where you've got 2 to 3 inches of rigid insulation underneath the slab and you've got 10 mil or thicker poly under the slab, then it's like building above grade and you've got good waterproofing around the house. If you got an older basement and you're not certain of what the moisture levels are in the basement, or moisture vapor that's migrating through the concrete slab, or moisture that's migrating through the slab and then evaporating off the surface or from the walls. There are so many dynamics there that you need to account for that then hardwood could be risky.
There are a couple ways to test for the presence of vapor drive, right, Mike? One is you know, a pin tight moisture meter, and I think depending on how much money you spend determines how accurate that test is. I think calcium chloride test, which is using some kind of absorbent mineral, calcium chloride specifically, to you weigh it pre and post test, right? Mike, you're nodding,
That's
and
going to
this
be the
tells you
most
how much
accurate
water.
test. Yep. Yep.
Yeah. And if you do these things, you can sometimes either eliminate that hardwood as a possibility, or I guess conceivably you could try and solve the transmission problem, right?
You can. I tried looking for the reference piece that Jonathan mentioned from GBA, and I couldn't find it. Sometimes, while GBA is a good resource for lots of things, there ends up being some stuff on Q&As where answers are given from people who are reading the GBA, and hopefully, well, sometimes some things pop up that may not be good practice as answers, and then, but hopefully other readers would comment and kind of knock down a bad idea and describe why it's not a good idea and what a good solution would be. So perhaps there is a good method to what's described beyond what the brief description that Jonathan has here, because you can put down a really thick poly vapor barrier. I mean, really thick, like 10, 12 mil, and put hardwood flooring over it if it's a floating floor, and you could have good success. I've seen it done on lots of jobs, and I've done it myself, provided there's no liquid moisture getting into the basement and the moisture humidity levels are controlled well with either ventilation and or dehumidification. So we're back to our
What do you
it
think?
depends.
Yeah, Brian, what do you think? I mean, Is this something you would do? I think is a good question to ask.
It's always in existing homes it's always tricky because there's a lot that you don't know or might be taking for granted or doing on faith. But I agree with Mike that it's going to be um, more about controlling the climate and the environment than it is about your flooring choice in a way. And I would say that even includes making sure that this isn't a basement that's going to get wet before you do anything, right? Because if a basement floods, well then you're throwing out your carpet, your hardwood flooring, and your drywall, your furniture, and everything else you have down there. So can you make sure that you have a dry basement? Can you do as much as possible to control moisture? He didn't mention, I don't think he mentioned ceiling heights or the potential to put down a little bit of insulation on the floor, which is also a nice way to create a more comfortable space, to slow vapor drive, to minimize condensing surfaces. All that kind of stuff can be, rigid insulation can be rigid foam insulation, particularly in a basement application, can be helpful with. Doing a floating floor on top of that is a very common, way to minimize risk. Some of our most popular articles, I think, on both GBA and in Fine Homebuilding in the past decade have been doing basement floors in just that way.
Yes.
uh, how to do it just that way. So, I'd consider that. It does seem like add it all together, and it does seem kind of like a risky flooring choice for a basement. Also because it's an expensive flooring choice, right?
Hmm.
Carpet's risky, but carpet's also generally, I mean, you can get expensive carpet, of course, but generally it's a more affordable product. So if you end up throwing out some carpet, you're not throwing out the same amount of dollars as maybe some nice oak hardwood flooring or something like that. So that's it's basements are managing risk. I think
Hmm. Exactly.
finishing basements is about managing risk.
Hmm.
So of course, slab on grade hardwood is a thing, especially in the southern part of the U.S. where slab on grade homes are so normal, and you can make this work. It just has to be dry, and as you guys suggest, bulk water's huge, vapor drive's huge. All these things have to be controlled. It's easier
Yeah.
to control when it's above grade. That's the whole gist of it. As
Yeah, and
far
in
as the
those
height,
cases, aren't Patrick? Don't they? I'm not so familiar with hardwood on slab on grade homes, but they're often glued down,
yeah.
and the adhesive often has some vapor control qualities.
Yeah, I think you may have done a story, or we worked together when someone else did one, but of an install. And Bostic is the company that jumps to mind that makes these vapor retarding adhesives that can help quite a bit in questionable installations.
Yeah,
I think you made a great point, Brian, that the you want to get this right because the stakes are high. You're going to be throwing out a bunch of hardwood if it gets wet, and you better you don't want that to happen because it's disruptive and expensive.
I believe we have another good article about this that might have been called minimizing risk in basement remodels. I know that it was by Steve Basic. I know, and I know we showed like levels of basement finishing and like based on Steve's assumptions of the riskiness of different basements. Really great article that we could link to on the show page, and anyone doing any basement finishing could check out. Because often finish the first thing you need to do when you finish a basement is fix your gutters or put in a French drain. Often what you need to do to be safe has nothing to do with your basement.
Yeah.
No, and those things are not going to show up in the finished project, right? It's like that's
Right.
yes.
And
No one
but
wants to be told you have to regrade before you can install a basement.
Right.
yeah, but for people who do it, they're going to get a lot more benefit than just a little bit drier basement. You're going to reduce the moisture load and humidity inside the house. You could have other problems that you don't even realize are
Yeah.
occurring. That getting the water away from a basement will help to mitigate.
I
Yeah,
think
for sure.
you know, Jonathan's original question was the transition between hardwood and carpeting, and I think we got on a bit of a tangent based on the question of is that a good idea? I think 3/4 inch hardwood lines up pretty good with carpet in my observation. If that's the only thing you're worried about, I would stick with an engineered product as you suggest, Jonathan, if you're not going to, go further in the remodel. If this is a basement that's been dry forever and never a problem and you feel confident putting down the hardwood, it should be a engineered product because it's way more tolerant of changes in humidity. And the after show. So we're going to talk about how contractors learn their craft and is it working? And I hope you all will tune in for that. And if you are a all access member to Fine Homebuilding, thank you very much for that. And thank all of you listening for listening to the podcast and your questions and feedback, which really does make the show better. Thanks so much. Thanks, guys. That was good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks to Mike, Brian, and Andres for joining me, and thanks to all of you for listening. Please remember to send us your comments, questions, and suggestions to fhbpodcast@taunton.com. And please like, comment, or review us however you're listening. It helps other folks find our podcast. Stay safe, everybody. Keep craft alive. Stay tuned for the after show, please.